Une voiture avec un nom français de 14 ans? C'est ma chaîne? Mon Dieu! Hi guys, Eric here, and welcome back to my channel. Today we will be having a look at this pristine 2007 Citroën C3 1.4 HDI, and I have two questions. Is it a good idea to buy one used? And did Citroën inject enough quirkiness into this car for it to stand out from the crowd? It's quite odd to know that Citroën offered two B-segment cars in the late 60s and 70s, but there was method to its madness. Citroën, as well as Renault, noticed that France had picked up the pieces after the tragedy that was World War II, and there was an opening in the market for a car that was a bit larger than a 2CV, which translates to 2 steam horses, but not as rudimental and rustic. So, in 1961, Citroën unveiled the Ami, which is French for friend. It was built on the same platform as the 2CV, but had some significant upgrades, such as a much stronger engine and more fleshed out interior. Even though the gap has been filled, Citroën noticed that there was another market gap for a car that is more practical than a 2CV, but not as expensive as the Ami. So, in 1968, the Diane was launched. It filled the gap perfectly by being more practical with a hatchback and a better competitor to the very popular Renault 4. It was also based on the Citroën 2CV, but with some minor styling changes to give it a less poverty-stricken look. Even though the Diane was supposed to ultimately replace the 2CV, it was only able to outsell it for 2 years, after which it always trailed behind. Not that it wasn't successful though, and like the Ami, it had a very advanced independent suspension setup found in the 2CV, giving both the Ami and the Diane a great ride. In 1978, with the Ami and Diane nearing its end, Citroën launched its replacement, the Citroën Visa. Interestingly, it was the first Citroën to be subject to PSA's platform sharing policy, being based on the same chassis as the Peugeot 104 and having the same engine as well as gearbox. The Visa was available with a host of 4-cylinder petrol engines, a 4-cylinder diesel engine, as well as a 2-stroke engine derived from the still ongoing 2CV. Like its predecessors, the Visa also had a really comfortable ride because of the same basic setup as the one found in the 2CV, although the Visa was able to go around corners. When it was time for the Visa's replacement, Citroën came prepared with the AX in 1986. It featured a whole line of petrol engines as well as 2 diesels. Interestingly, the 1.4-litre naturally aspirated diesel achieved an amazing fuel economy figure of 2.7 litres per 100 kilometers over 1,600 kilometers. It was placed in the Guinness World Book of Records as the most economical production car. Keeping with tradition, the AX also sported a very comfortable ride and a huge amount of wheel travel. Most important though, it was very light for a car its size and had a drag coefficient of 0.31. It too was a big success, selling over 2.4 million units. With the AX replacement, the Saxo, PSA decided to make it almost identical to its own Peugeot 106, which in itself is an AX derivative. Nevertheless, the Saxo was a major success and found its home lovingly in the arms of car modifiers, particularly in Britain. Peugeot and Citroën decided to do something very interesting with the successor of the Saxo. They would replace it with 2 different cars, the C2 and the C3, with the C3 being for the more conservative buyer and the C2 for the younger market. The C2 also came equipped with stiffer springs to make it more sporty and achieve better road handling. I remember when the C2 came to South Africa. I fell in love with it, especially the VTS model. Considering I was really young, I wasn't really interested in its bigger brother, the C3. But now that I'm all grown up, I'm glad that I can give this car a second look. It must be so tough for car makers to design cars, especially with the bean counters and the red tape yielding them at every turn. But as always, Citroën has managed to make a car that looks quirky enough without being ugly. I really like the egg design. It reminds me quite a lot of the Diane. Thankfully, it is much safer in its construction, achieving a 4 out of 5 star rating from Euro NCAP. Engines consisted of 4-cylinder petrol and diesel units. I have the 1.4 turbo diesel here, and to me, it is the pick of the bunch with 50 kilowatts and a very healthy 160 newton meters of torque, sitting very low down in the rev range. Only thing I would want is better spec. I would love some alloy wheels as well as extra airbags. Not that this model is Spartan. Allow me to explain. The first thing that I notice when I get into the C3 is the airiness of this cabin. These windows are absolutely massive and the window line is low. Combine that with extremely thin A and B pillars and you have a very airy cabin on your hands. The Citroën C3 came out all the way back in 2002, so this is a rather old piece of design, but I must admit, at least with the interior, it aged really well. Ergonomically speaking, everything is where you expect it to be, rather conventional for a Citroën. Thankfully, they did manage to make the cabin look rather youthful and quirky, like Citroëns of old. The dashboard has two different types of textures, one rather smooth and the other ribbed for her pleasure. The dials, which we will get back to later, look futuristic, and these air vents are all circular to give it a rather youthful and sporty look. On top of the dash, you will find the monocolored dot matrix infotainment screen. I am very happy to see that it is placed so close to the driver's eye line, which means that you don't have to take your eyes off the road when you want to see what song is playing, for instance. Below the infotainment system, there are two circular air vents with a rather interesting beehive type of design. Between said air vents, you'll find the hazards button as well as the door lock unlock button. I am so happy to see the hazards button so prominently placed. The door lock unlock button, however, does result from a very cheap sound emanating from the doors. Move your gaze downwards and you're greeted with the stereo unit. The very same stereo unit found in almost all Peugeot Citroën Group cars since the early 2000s. The system works really well, especially considering its age, but the buttons are a bit too small and on top of each other. Thankfully, the buttons are very well labelled, so you do work your way around them. The climate controls is another panel that has been lifted out of the PSA Group's parts bin. It feels a little cheap to use, but considering the age of the C3, it is par for the course. Considering how little effort manufacturers these days put into the door cards of the more affordable products, I am so happy to see Citroën did their very best to keep things interesting. There are no less than 3 different textures of plastic and even some fabric found on the cards. I also like these swooping cuts, although I would have preferred a bit of differentiation in the colours to help break the wall of black and grey. Still, this at least helps the chrome-covered door handle to really stick out. The window switches aren't found on the doors, however. Instead, they are housed underneath the climate controls in front of the gear lever. The electrically adjustable door mirror switch isn't on the door either. Instead, it is housed underneath the driver's air vent. This makes the door panel look rather naked, which in retrospect explains its quirky design. Speaking of quirky, this quarter window is so interesting to me. I love its swooping design. The steering wheel kind of reveals the age of the first generation C3 because it is much too plain and boring. The only shiny bits on it is the double chevron Citroën logo. Thankfully, it does come equipped with the obligatory PSA Group's column-mounted audio controls. It is placed on a fixed stalk behind the steering wheel, and once you're used to it, it does a great job of keeping both hands on the wheel. Then you notice the dials. This is the first time that I get to see some of Citroën's quirkiness coming through. There is nothing like this coming from other manufacturers. The rev counter with black dials on a sporty white background sits on top in a half moon design. Below it, in a rounded rectangle, you will find the digital dials, 2000 style. It communicates fuel level, total distance traveled, your current speed, as well as your trip information. Sadly, no trip computer on this model, and crucially, no temperature gauge. Now, it can be quite bad for an engine if you rev it while it's still cold. I wish I knew when it wasn't. Any hoozles, below that you will lastly find some of the warning lights. All in all, I must admit, I love how it looks completely different without being too intimidating. Then there are the seats. They look really interesting. They don't look as though they give any support whatsoever. They almost remind me more of modern sofas. They are wrapped in 3 different types of fabric, and they have stood the test of time. In fact, contrary to what a lot of people think about French cars, in 14 years, nothing has fallen off, broke, or even moved. I can't hear any creaks either, with the exception of opening and closing the doors. And some Q20 on the hinges will take care of that. I am really impressed. So, design-wise at least, things look really good. But what about when we move to the practical side of things? Starting with storage. The glove box is too small. It is barely big enough to fit a pair of gloves. This is because Peugeot and Citroën don't move the fuse box along with the steering wheel for their right-hand drive cars. It's really rather disappointing. The door pockets try to make up for it by being very deep, if a tad too narrow. Below the stereo unit, you will find a rubberized open compartment. The rubber not only helps to prevent things from launching out when you accelerate, but also helps to mitigate rattles. Then, between the 2 window switches, you will find a comically shallow cup holder. I truly think it will work much better as a placeholder for keys. Do not put cups there. Behind the handbrake, you will find much deeper cup holders, but they are still too small in diameter. All in all, not that great. The boot, however, is a different story. At 303 litres, it is very big, especially considering the boot floor is so low. The rear seats can also fold almost completely flat in a 60-40 split for even more space. This does result, however, in a very big ridge that hinders through loading. Also, because of the low boot floor, this results in a big loading lip, which makes lifting heavy things out a challenge. Fortunately, the boot opening is very wide. It is a good amount of space, and you get a full-size spare tire. Get in the back and things aren't that great. Knee room really is at a premium, and when I sit upright, my hair is brushing against the headliner. Thankfully, because of the low window line, children will enjoy the experience. The rear doors also has the same quirky design as those in the front, and the door's armrest also is covered in fabric. Storage, however, is almost non-existent. These door pockets are so narrow they can only fit a credit card or 2. The first thing that comes to mind when I think of Citroëns is its award-winning hydropneumatic suspension. Even back in the 1950s with the DS, it had a supremely good ride. And over the decades, Citroën has continued to improve it. I bring that up because even though the C3 has a conventional suspension setup, it feels as though it carries the spirit of Citroëns of old because of this extraordinary good ride. Driving the Citroën C3 around town is a joy. There is great all-round visibility and the steering is nice and light. I also love the progressive nature of the clutch and the punchy 1.4 litre turbo diesel engine. A surprisingly tight turning circle, as well as relatively small dimensions, complete the package and make for a rather enjoyable town runabout. The only thing to keep in mind is that while the diesel engine is very smooth, it is rather loud and it isn't the best noise out there either. Out on the open road, and two things jump out at me. One is the engine. Well, it can be a bit loud under acceleration. It is really punchy. Now, I wouldn't call it quick, but you will appreciate that extra torque when you want to overtake safely. The other is noise, vibration, and harshness levels. The only thing I can hear is some wind whistle, as well as the background noise of the engine. Road noise and tire roar, however, is surprisingly low for a little hatchback, and there's barely any rattles around the cabin after 14 years. This makes for an almost perfect long-distance cruiser. I say almost because these seats don't have the best support and they're a bit on the firm side, making for some achy backs after a couple of 100 kilometers. Out on the twisties, and things get rather interesting and even exciting, but not for the reasons you might think. Permit me to elaborate. This lovely suspension that awards you a comfortable ride around town and on the open road has a trade-off. Body roll. A lot of body roll. So much so that the car feels unsettled when going around corners. At first I thought it was the steering, but the steering is actually nice and direct, if lacking a bit of feedback. Another thing that distracts a bit from the driving experience is the gearbox. While I never struggle to find the right gear when I need it, I would not call it slick. When in gear, it feels a bit loose, as though the car is in neutral. A driver's car, this is not. But expecting that from a Citroën is like expecting a porno to have a plot. It isn't made for that, and I'm so happy to see that even though Peugeot has silenced Citroën's quirkiness in general, they still injected just enough eccentricity to make this car stand out from the crowd. It feels very modern to drive, and the interior has aged rather well, which is saying something. Also, because South Africans think French cars are junk, you can pick these up at extremely low prices, and this particular model has proven unbelievably reliable, only needing a new water pump. Where is the but? Thank you so much for watching another one of my videos. If you enjoyed this review, please remember to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, remember to subscribe to my channel with all notifications turned on. That way you'll be notified when I release new videos. I release a brand new review every Wednesday mid-afternoon, so stay tuned. If you are interested in some behind the scenes footage as well as a peek into my personal life, be sure to follow me on social media, links in the description box below. I hope you guys have an amazing day. Till next time, bye.